Hello and welcome to the Starting Sisters series, where we cover everything from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the Adepta Sororitas, also known as the Sisters of Battle. In this video, we'll cover a set of rules that are very prevalent within the Sisters army, and while these rules don't apply to every unit, they show up enough to have their own category. They add a level of complexity and uniqueness to the Sisters of Battle that is not seen in other armies, and they also increase the interest in playing this army. For those already experienced with the Sisters of Battle, this will simply be a review, but those who are either new to the army or are looking to learn more about it, this will hopefully introduce you to a set of rules that either sparks your interest or helps you play against the Sisters of Battle. To begin this video, we'll look at the most interesting and unique set of rules that the Sisters have. The most unique ability that they have is actually a two-part ability, with the first half of that ability being the Miracle Dice. What the Miracle Dice do is they let you store dice within a certain pool, and it ultimately ends up feeling like you're cheating sometimes, but in a legal way. A miracle die works as follows. If you meet a certain condition, you roll a die and take whatever number you rolled and add it to your miracle die pool, unmodified, unless an ability specifies otherwise. This is used later when using the second half of this ability known as performing an act of faith. The following conditions are how you gain miracle dice. Outside of special items and rules that modify this, you gain miracle dice in the following ways. You gain one at the start of each battle round, or if you meet one of the following conditions during any phase. There are 7 phases total within a battle round for each player. The first way you would gain a miracle die is if a unit with the Acts of Faith ability destroys an enemy unit. Not every unit has Acts of Faith. A power unit like Mortifiers doesn't, for example. So while you can usually meet this criteria in the shooting and fight round, you do have to remember that if you're picking targets in certain cases, you might want to order your operations such that the unit with the Act of Faith is landing the killing blow on the unit as opposed to one that doesn't have it. You won't always be able to achieve this, but in most cases you should be able to gain a miracle die in each one of those phases once you start getting into melee combat and shooting. The other way you can gain a miracle die is if a character with the Acts of Faith is destroyed. This is rather self-explanatory, but I should mention the Sisters have a lot of very powerful buff characters, and while this isn't the primary way you would like to gain miracle dice, it is one of the different ways. The third way of gaining a miracle die is if a psychic power is resisted by a unit from your army with Acts of Faith. This is a great way to generate miracle dice in the psychic phase, in which you are normally not doing much, since Sisters of Battle do not have psychers. Not only that, but the Sisters of Battle have amazing potential in denying psychic powers with some of their abilities. However, you cannot use an Act of Faith to deny a psychic power in order to gain a miracle die, so this has to be done naturally. And finally, the other natural way of gaining a miracle die is by rolling an unmodified 1 in the moral phase with a unit with an Act of Faith. This cannot be done by using an Act of Faith, just as the previous ability. There are plenty of other ways of gaining miracle dice, whether through stratagems, items, or character abilities, but those will be covered when we look at the different models and abilities that those models have, and as such, these are just the generic ways of gaining miracle dice. Now that we know that a miracle die is a die that you rolled and added to your miracle dice pool, unmodified, when you've met a certain criteria, we'll take a look at the second half of the ability and how it functions. The second half of the ability is known as performing an act of faith. You can perform an act of faith once each phase on the following rolls: advance, charge, deny the witch, also known as resisting a psychic power, wound, saving, throw, damage, and moral test. To perform an Act of Faith, you pick a unit with the Act of Faith ability, and instead of making a roll, you substitute the roll with a die from your Miracle Dice pool. Then roll the remaining dice you didn't substitute. This is why the last 2 abilities to gain a Miracle Die specifically state that you cannot use a Miracle Die to gain that ability, as otherwise it would be a free ability. One other thing to mention is that the Miracle Dice do not count as a modifier or being modified in themselves, so a Miracle Die that is a 1 counts as an unmodified 1, and a miracle die that is a 6 counts as an unmodified 6. This is huge for passing certain tests or triggering certain abilities. Do note that the substitution can only be done for 1 roll, so each attack is considered an individual roll even though you normally roll them all at the same time. Though something like a charge roll, which is 1 roll that uses 2 dice, is still 1 roll and both dice can be substituted. There is an FAQ that explains this, and I'll put that on screen for you to see. Now, even though you are restricted to 1 miracle die substitution per phase, there are many different ways around it, such as an item like the Simulacrum Imperialis, which lets you substitute more than 1 die per phase. But remember, the miracle dice are a limited resource that you have to generate before you can use, so using them haphazardly can leave you bereft when you're in need of a specific roll to make or break a game. So this is why early on I said this feels like cheating, as you're essentially rigging your dice with this ability, and it's insanely powerful. Think of it this way, you know your miracle dice, so as long as you have 2 6s within your miracle dice pool, you can make every charge roll, and ones pass every moral test, denying the which can be assured as well. Deep strike charges are usually 9 inches away and are very sketchy, but with Acts of Faith on something like Zephyrms, you can always be assured to make your charge out of deep strike if you have a 5 and a 4 or a 6 and a 3 in your pool or better. Though remember, every time you substitute a roll, you consume that miracle die, so you have to also consider which combinations of dice are most optimal to use. Furthermore, not every unit has Acts of Faith. Going back to our mortifiers, they do not have Acts of Faith. This doesn't make a unit like this bad, as in their case, they're statted in such a way to be good enough without these special abilities. There are other ways to spend miracle dice as well, though Acts of Faith is probably the most common one. To give an example of a different way to spend miracle dice, there is a stratagem called Moments of Grace, where you can discard any number of miracle dice to buff a save, hit, or wound roll after you've already made the roll, so you can first make the roll and then decide how much you want to improve it by. And one thing to take into account with this ability, it does not specify that the model has to have Acts of Faith, it just simply specifies it has to be an Adepta Sororitas model. That's an interesting caveat and an ability otherwise reserved specifically for units that fall within models that have Acts of Faith. And this stratagem is a great way to waste miracle dice that you think you would otherwise not have a use for. Most likely you'll be looking at rolls of 2, for example, within your pool. Now that we've covered what is probably the most complex Sister's special ability, let's look at some of the simpler abilities that we see across many different units. The first ability we'll take a look at is called Zealot. Zealot is an ability that appears on a lot of oddball units, such as Death Cult Assassins, Penitent Engines, and even Archflagellants, as well as many power units within the Sisters army, such as the Sisters Repentia. All this ability does is it says if you charge or make a heroic intervention with this unit, this ability allows you to reroll hit rolls on melee attacks in this turn. This is incredibly good on something like Sisters Repentia, thanks to the fact that you have an incredibly easy time making charges because of your miracle dice, as all of a sudden you can almost always assure that you're going to make your charge if you have the proper miracle dice. Sadly, something like the Zephyrms don't have this ability, but they have plenty of other goodies. While other units, such as the Archflagellants, have this ability, they unfortunately do not have the Acts of Faith ability, so they cannot make a successful charge roll as easily as the Sisters Repentia can. This is one of the shortfallings of the Archflagellants that probably make them a little weaker than they should be and keep them from seeing play in a lot of army lists. After the Zealot ability, we have the Shield of Faith. This is a 2-part ability, and boy is this one stacked. The first part of this ability is the less interesting one, as all it does is give you a 6+ invulnerable save for any model that has a Shield of Faith. This is fine to have, as so many different units have this, including your basic sister unit. The good thing is that it can be modified in a lot of different ways, such as the ability that Junith has, which improves the invulnerable save by 1 to a maximum of 4+ for friendly models within 6 inches of her, so you can make a lot of your sister's units very tanky with these ability modifiers. However, it's the second part of this ability that's incredibly powerful, as it gives any model with this ability the chance to negate any psychic power within 24 inches of that model by making a Deny the Witch roll of only 1d6 instead of 2d6. Sisters not only have miracle dice for this roll, but also have all kinds of ways to buff this. And an ability like this is crazy to have on so much of your army, especially with all the different ways to modify it and it being on your basic troops. For those of you who followed my AdMech series, you will know that there's the Graia Forge world that's good enough to soup into a list just for the stratagem that has a similar ability, which is stronger on the baseline, but once you factor in all the Sisters modifiers, it's comparable and Sisters don't have to use command points or dilute special rules to gain this ability. Not only that, but the Sisters have a stratagem that functions very similar to the Graia stratagem as well. So any psychic army that's going to go up against a Sisters list is going to have a very hard time resolving abilities that are key to their success. Now we come to another ability that's somewhat complicated. This ability is called the Sacred Rites. You only get this ability if all your models in your army have the Adepta Sororitas or Adeptus Ministorum keyword. Only models with this ability gain any benefit. This reduces soup capabilities, but is a great bonus for any pure Sisters army. You either pick one of these from the list of 6, or you roll 2d6 and you get both. Though if you roll doubles, you only get the one that you rolled. So there is a small risk of only gaining one even if you roll for it. This choice is made after deployment but before the start of the battle itself. Whatever ability you pick or whatever abilities you roll for are active all game, so you can use these abilities as a counter in some cases, while in many other cases you'll simply roll for them and hope to get a couple of good ones to buff your army. Let's take a look at the abilities and how you might use them. In the number 1 slot is Hand of the Emperor. This reads, add 1 to the charge and advance rolls for units with sacred rights. This is decent but doesn't modify movement itself, which really hurts this option. And as most, if not all units that have sacred rights also have Acts of Faith, you'll usually be using miracle dice for those options as opposed to this ability. Still, this ability could be good in some cases, such as if you're making multiple charges in a turn and there's one that you critically have to use miracle dice for, and a couple others that benefit from the 1 extra inch of charge range, as you might be only able to modify one of those rolls with the miracle dice. The second ability is Spirit of the Martyr. This reads that when a model dies on a roll of 5+, if it has sacred rights, it makes one last attack with a shooting or melee weapon. Not the best, but it can sometimes put out a little extra damage. The third ability is the most situational, but it's probably the best one when it's in play. It's called Aegis of the Emperor, and what it reads is, when you make a Deny the Witch test to negate a psychic power, you add 3 to the total roll. This is absurd against any army that is psychic heavy. When you take into account Shield of Faith and all the miracle dice options you have, essentially when you're playing Sisters, if you really need to deny a psychic power, you're gonna deny that psychic power and there's nothing your opponent can really do about it. The fourth ability is Divine Guidance. What this does is it adds +1 AP on shooting when you roll a 6 to wound. This is just okay, but it is a little weak considering that a lot of special weapons for Sisters are already really powerful in terms of AP, such as multi-meltas, though at the end of the day, this is a nice generic buff that can do a little bit of work. At number 5, we have the Passion. Melee attacks with an unmodified roll of 6 to hit score an extra hit. This can be rather brutal with something like the Repentia and the Zephyrum, though as a whole, if you're running a lot of Repentia, this turns them into an absolute blender of a unit. Finally, in the number 6 slot is Light of the Emperor. This allows you to reroll morale tests. It's okay, but it's definitely one of the weaker abilities. As you can see, some are great and some are just okay. In cases where you're playing against psychic heavy abilities, you're obviously going to take the Aegis ability. In many others, you'll just roll to get 2 or pick whichever one makes the most sense based on your army composition. You can also just opt to lose this ability and soup with a different army to gain something that Sisters might not already have, though the army is good enough to essentially play on its own, and it doesn't really have any specific holes that you really need to patch by souping in a different faction. As such, you're usually just going to run a straight Sisters list and gain these benefits by either picking or rolling. And there's definitely justification for rolling for these abilities as opposed to picking, as there are going to be times where there's no ability that particularly stands out, and gaining 2 marginal buffs is better than gaining 1 marginal buff. In the next video, we'll take a look at Holy Orders for the Sisters. Once again, the Holy Orders apply selectively to different models, and they have a whole slew of different abilities, as there are several different orders you can pick from. Some characters within the Sisters army are forced to be within a certain order, while other units can pick whichever order they want. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on within the Sisters army, which is what makes them so complex, but once you learn it, it becomes rather easy. It is also an army where you want to have a good reference guide or cheat sheet with you to make sure you're taking advantage of all your special rules, modifiers, and auras, as they apply very differently to very different units. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more, please like and subscribe, and have a great day. Bye.